This is a good time to tell you that everything I'm about to say is alleged and simply my own opinion. Do your own research and form your own opinions. Let's begin. As we approach the trial of BK, and after watching recent current events, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that whether convicted or not, BK will never see the firing squad. That's the narrative that has been presented to us by all major media outlets, that if BK is convicted, he faces death by firing squad. So let's talk about it. The supermajority of death row inmates in Idaho will never see the firing squad. That's not what this is about. We'll get back to the specifics on that later.
Legit casual, #KJB. Do you think the university cares about the victims and their families? Seems like complete disregard because of the demolition. All I can do is read the statement from this gentleman here, President Scott Green, University of Idaho, and he said that the house is a grim reminder of the heinous act that took place there. And then he says, this is the part here, quote, "While we appreciate the emotional connection some family members of the victims may have to this house, it is time for its removal and to allow the collective healing of our community to continue."
Just off campus, boarded up like a frightening scar. 1122 King Road. The school, the prosecutors, even the defense wanted the house torn down as soon as possible. But some of the families didn't, and they fought it, and it's a good thing they did, because this week, prosecutors and the FBI were back there, inside, clipboards in hand.
We remember they fought and they fought to keep the house where the murders happened standing. The University of Idaho wanted to tear the house down. The Goncalves family fought it. The house ultimately was not torn down, and it turns out the FBI has now gone back out to the house.
They got to come back in, now they want to take down the house. None of it makes sense. You know how the school owns the house now?
Yeah.
And the guy that gave them to the house is now getting sued for something from the families, because it happened on his property. It's just a mess.
The public has been made aware that parties could legally have halted the demolition of this house. I can see it in my comments. In every video I post, there is more and more sympathy for Bryan as time goes on, particularly when we see the largest piece of evidence in this case being destroyed for no other reason than the university finds it more convenient. Some of you might remember the explosive case of Arizona versus Jodi Arias.
Travis was slaughtered. He was stabbed 29 times.
Convicted murderer Jodi Arias will not be put to death. The fate of the woman who brutally murdered her ex-boyfriend, Travis Alexander, was sealed. A jury could not reach a unanimous verdict over the death penalty. Arias, who was convicted for the 2008 murder of her ex-boyfriend, who was shot in the forehead and nearly decapitated.
Jodi Arias was convicted of a horrible unaliving of her boyfriend in one of the most brutal, cruel, and inhumane ways you can imagine, including mutilation. But the jury spared her life, and this shocked not only her small community, but the world. And the reason the jury spared her life is because her trial was very confusing, and because many people began to see the human side of Jodi as the trial went on. So I'm going to use this case and draw some new parallels to what is inevitably the case we're going to be seeing this summer.
By a show of hands, who voted to give Jodi Arias the death penalty? All three of you. Why?
Because the state proved their case. It was premeditated.
They also had no doubt about the aggravating circumstances surrounding the way Jodi Arias killed Travis Alexander, a decision that made Arias eligible for the death penalty.
The stabbing and the slitting of the throat, why did it go so far? Why didn't a gunshot stop it? Or why didn't a stab wound stop it? And
therein lies the premeditation.
Exactly.
For a lot of people,
That's
it
what
came
took us
down
right
to
there.
in between stab wounds, the switching of the weapons.
But the task of actually sentencing her to death proved impossible.
HLN host Nancy Grace is shocked by this turn of events.
If you're going to have the death penalty, Jodi Arias is the perfect candidate.
The jury can sympathize with the defendant for a number of things. It doesn't just have to be sympathizing with them to spare their life. They could sympathize with the defendant because of the circumstances, or more commonly, because there is extreme confusion involved in the case. In this next explosive clip from Chaos Sector, you're going to see one of Kaylee's friends talk about the morning that she was found unalived and the extreme contradiction that was never pushed back by the mainstream media. Take a listen to this explosive soundbite.
I present it this way because Katie's so-called concern contradicts the actual setting at the home. The timelines don't match. If she called around 10 a.m., then this means others had been informed also, perhaps even earlier. We know this based on an actual student's accounts in his interview. But from the media's narrative, Katie calling around 10 a.m. proves that she was aware of Kaylee being, well, harmed. Yet how would she know this unless the housemates had notified others around that time? Of course, none of that is in Dylan's affidavit. No mention of Dylan or Bethany aware of an emergency around 10 a.m. in which they had notified friends. Remember, the call went out around 12 p.m. Those friends knew about the murders earlier than the reported discovery around 12 p.m.
If he pled guilty and said, I'll plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence, have you thought about that?
Yeah, I don't want that because I do know, I studied the criminal system and the difference between life in prison. Even if it's 20, 30 years, he's 23 hours locked up. He doesn't get to do what is it, BTK?
BTK killer?
PTK.
Or whatever.
We've found out that he writes papers for other prisoners and gets treated really well because he's intelligent and he's able to help other prisoners get preferential treatment through the legal system.
So now I'm going to read to you from this information-packed article that I found on BoiseStatePublicRadio.org. It's called How the Death Penalty Works in Idaho. The death penalty in Idaho, as in every state across the country, has undergone significant changes throughout history as constitutional interpretations and public support ebb and flow. Capital punishment has been legal in Idaho since its territorial days in 1864. Over a century later, the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated all existing death penalty laws in the 1972 case Furman versus Georgia. Time period, Idaho executed 26 people according to the Death Penalty Information Center. State lawmakers here adopted a new capital punishment law in 1974, roughly a year after its previous policy was invalidated. Idaho wouldn't execute another inmate until after the temporary moratorium until 1994, when prison officials killed convicted murderer Keith Wells via lethal injection. In the post-Furman era, Idaho has overseen 3 executions, the most recent being Richard Levitt in 2012. 8 people are currently on death row. State legislatures legalized the firing squad during the 2023 session over concerns about the availability of lethal injection drugs, with many questions about the process still to be answered. And I'm actually going to skip forward in this article to step 2, the trial and sentencing. It's not enough to simply charge a person with first-degree murder and have a jury unanimously convict them. Prosecutors must also get a jury, if a jury trial isn't wavered by the defendant, to unanimously agree that there was at least one aggravating factor applicable in this case and that those factors can't be mitigated by offsetting circumstances. Those aggravating factors can include the defendant has already been convicted of a murder in the past, if it was a murder for hire scenario, if the murder was committed during another serious crime, I won't say the rest, if the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, manifesting exceptional depravity. And it says that this can include, so that would imply that there are other aggravating factors also. Following any conviction, a special sentencing hearing with the same jury, if possible, is held to determine any aggravating or mitigating circumstances. If the jury can't unanimously agree on aggravating circumstances, the defendant is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So one thing I want to bring up is there's also the mitigating circumstances. So they didn't list these here. I wonder what the mitigating circumstances are. I'm just going to read to you one sentence in step 4, the death warrant. Upon serving the death warrant, the defendant is immediately transported to the state's maximum security facility in Kona, if they are not already there, and put into isolated confinement. So that is what the Gonzalez family was talking about. He's not going to be in Gen Pop if he is sentenced to death versus life in prison. And many death row inmates spend 20 or 30 years. Like I said, the super majority of these death row inmates never see the firing squad. So I'm going to skip past the appeals and past the death warrant. And we're going to go down to the execution. This is important too. Step 5, the execution. Currently, lethal injection is still the primary method which Idaho officials can carry out an execution. So not a firing squad, folks. Not a firing squad. That's why the title of this video is There Will Be No Squad, is because it's highly doubtful. State lawmakers in 2023 opted to reinstate the firing squad as an alternative method should the required drugs to administer a lethal injection not be available. IDAHO4 is in the process of creating a standard operating process for execution by firing squad, though it hasn't been released yet. So basically, at the conclusion of my research, what I've found is that there are, first of all, it's not likely that a firing squad will be used, but just the fact that it could be used can persuade some jurors. So that's just another thing to think about. And now I'm just going to show you some really powerful sound bites.
Relatives of the murder victim broke down crying. The sound of sobbing filled the Arizona courtroom, and Arias looked distressed with a hand to her cheek.
You could hear Travis Alexander's family gasp. You could see them bend over in half, physically bent over, crying out in pain.
HLN host Nancy Grace is shocked by this turn of events.
If you're going to have the death penalty, Jodi Arias is the perfect candidate.
NewsNation senior national correspondent Bryan Kohberger sat down with the parents of Kaylee Gonzalez, a victim of that crime.
There's 3 other families involved here. We're not the only ones.
Right.
This isn't just our daughter.
Right, some
and
might
I know
not
that
want to go through the trial.
I know some of the other families definitely would be, yes, like, let's go. Where do I sign? And I understand that, 100%. But just because, our opinion is yay or nay doesn't mean that, that's what we get. I've never drove by it. I don't want to. But it's still going to be, when they're like, that house is gone, it is going to be very emotional for me. But that wasn't why, the emotional side of things, just like, I don't want to hear that. Like, I want to see this guy die. Like, I don't want him breathing any longer. Because they say, oh, he's living in hell already. No, he's not. Not the hell that I think of. The hell that I think of is literally terrifying, agonizing torture, day in and day out. I don't care. Latah County Jail is not agonizing.
I knew in my heart what was best for those girls and Ethan. I knew what was best was to keep that around until they did more.